Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
I am going to be honest with you the way I would be with a friend who has seen me at my worst and knows that I can keep my voice steady even when my hands want to shake. Because the first thing you should know is that the line about not everyone surviving in the corporate world was not a joke tossed across a quiet table. It was a dig sharpened over years of small humiliations and smug warnings delivered by a brother who treated his career like a private club and treated me like the guest who should feel grateful just to stand in the lobby. And when he laughed and took that breath that always comes before the next cut, my father turned toward me with that careful tone he saves for announcements he believes will make him look wise. And he said the sentence that rewired the room in a second, asking if that is why I had just been hired to replace him, and I swear to you there was this microsecond of silence that felt less like drama and more like inventory, everyone counting up every small thing they had ever thought about me and about him, and suddenly reconsidering the balance sheet. The part one have not said out loud to anyone until now is that I knew this moment was coming, not the exact timing or the exact wording, but the energy of it, because people always think big reversals happen with a single decision or a lucky break, when in reality they happen because you stack 1,000 unglamorous choices on top of each other, and you stop giving away your leverage for approval, which is what I did the day my brother forwarded one of my old emails to a mutual contact and called it a friendly heads up about my communication gaps, a phrase that never leaves your head once it has been used on you, and I decided then that I would never again announce my plans to anyone who might benefit from shrinking them. So when I left my last job under the official reason of wanting a reset, what I really did was remove myself from a track that was going to keep me near his shadow and instead move toward people who did not know my family tree. And I made coffee appointments with the kind of operators who care about numbers and execution more than family name or social polish, and I listened more than I spoke, and I built a quiet stack of receipts that showed I could make a mess better and cheaper than most people he would recommend, and I kept my mouth shut at holidays while he performed stories about late-night calls and executive dinners and pressure I supposedly could never handle. All while anyone who actually knew me knew that I was the one who cleaned crises without needing applause for it. When the headhunter he once bragged about using asked me a simple question about what I would do with a broken sales funnel that was bleeding market share quarter after quarter, I gave an answer that was not pretty but was honest. And I gave timelines that were realistic rather than heroic, and I refused to sell magic, and I could feel the room shift even though the room, at that time, was only a phone call at 7 in the morning with a woman who has heard 1,000 performances and can tell the difference between someone bluffing and someone who has done the work. And after that I did something that will sound small but mattered a lot, which was that I asked for the reference checks to be done with the people who had argued with me, not the people who loved me. Because if you really want a leadership role, you need your scars to talk for you. I will not pretend I was not tempted to hint at all this during family texts in the weeks before Christmas, because the itch to foreshadow your win is real when you have been told for years that you are too soft or too naive, but I kept the circle small. And by small I mean me and the one person at the company who was responsible for fixing the unit my brother had been running on autopilot, a person who did not care that he and I share a last name and who, to her credit, warned me that if I took this job I would be walking into a house he built with shortcuts, which meant that winning would not be the same as being liked, and I told her that being liked is a currency you can mint later if the cash flow is strong. So we sat at the table and my brother laughed, and he leaned back with that practiced ease he uses when he wants to project that everything is a joke and nothing can touch him, and my dad, who loves winning almost as much as he loves family, gave the line that felt like a chess clock slamming down, and I felt every eye skip from his face to mine as if trying to pick up a glitch in the story, and I kept my fork in my hand and my expression neutral, because I have learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a moment like that is not to perform triumph, but to let other people do the math on their own. And Ryan tried to laugh again, but it came out thin. And he said something about misunderstandings and restructuring and how titles move around in December, and that this must be some kind of slip, and I just said that I was happy to answer questions in January when everything goes official, which is not a victory speech but a boundary. Here is the part that might make you shake your head at me, because it will sound colder than you expect from me. Yet it was the first small revenge I allowed myself to take, and it was not a rant or a reveal or a dramatic speech. It was a very simple move I had planned in case he tried to humiliate me, which was to pull out my phone and, in full view of the table, send a calendar invite titled Transition Kickoff to a small group that did not include him, but did include the new chief executive and the operations lead and the compliance council. An invite that had been drafted days earlier with a note that said materials will be circulated to the group only, and then I set the send time to now rather than the next morning. And I watched the micro-reactions play across the faces of the people who were copied as their devices buzzed, and I felt the room adjust to a new center of gravity without my having to say anything that could be thrown back at me later. He asked me what I had just done, and I said that I had sent something work-related and that I would not discuss it at dinner because I did not want to turn a holiday into a meeting, and that calm sentence, more than any little jab I could have thrown, landed harder than anything he could answer without looking petty, and he knew it, which is why he switched to that familiar tone where he pretends to worry about me, warning me that corporate life eats people who think they can fix everything with plans and that I should not mistake a title for power, and I said I agree, which is why I do not mistake noise for leverage, and after that there was nothing left for him to do but cut his food and pretend he was still in control of the conversation. If you are wondering whether I enjoyed it, I will tell you the truth, which is that it did not feel like gloating or like justice in the cinematic sense. It felt like finally being allowed to stop explaining myself, and that is a different kind of relief. And maybe not as loud, but a lot more stable, and while everyone else tried to restart small talk about travel and recipes, I kept thinking about the message I would get in the morning confirming that the transition timeline had been moved up. Because that was the other condition I set when I accepted the offer, that once the internal pieces were in place we would not drag it through the mud of rumor, which protects the team and, yes, also protects me from any last-minute theater. I did not say any of that at the table. I did not need to, because his expression did the work for me, and if you tell me that was a little cruel I will not argue. I will only say that sometimes the healthiest boundary is the one that looks like silence. And that night I chose silence and a single well-timed send button instead of the speech I could have delivered, and it set up the next step in a way that talking never could, because the moment those invites landed a second email went out from operations to freeze access on a handful of shared folders pending role changes, a routine control that would look procedural to anyone else, but would feel very personal to him when he tried to open them in the morning. And that is where I am going to leave you for now, with him pretending to chew while everyone pretended not to stare, and with me smiling at my plate like nothing in the world had shifted, even though a quiet lever had just been pulled. Because the real fun did not start at the table, it started the next business day when the first locked door appeared, and that is the part one I'm ready to tell you next. If you asked my brother to explain our history, he would probably say that I am sensitive and that the corporate world does not have the patience to babysit feelings, which is a convenient story for a man who learned early that if he frames your reactions as weakness, he never has to examine his own behavior. And I let that narrative stand for too long because I thought the worst thing you could be in business was emotional. Until I learned that the actual worst thing is predictable, and once I stopped being predictable to him, the entire board he played on started to look different, which is why the morning after Christmas, when he opened a shared folder and found a polite access error, it was not an accident or a glitch or some petty flex. It was the first visible domino in a line I had set months earlier after the last time he cost me a promotion by feeding a mutual contact a soft rumor about my supposed over-communication, that slippery phrase people use when they do not want to say that you are thorough and they do not benefit from your thoroughness. The truth is that he did not push me out in a dramatic scene with an ultimatum or a public critique. He did it the way some people steal credit in meetings, by tiny increments that are easy to deny later. By forwarding a draft of my work to someone senior with a casual note about how I might be too close to the details, by inviting me to client calls where I was asked to take notes and then leaving before the hard questions landed, by telling me I needed executive presence while using me as the person who prepared his presence for him, and I will admit that for a while I accepted that as a kind of tuition, thinking that if I learned the game hard enough he would one day move aside and let me play it fully. which tells you everything you need to know about how little I understood the incentives at that time. What changed for me was not a pep talk or a motivational book or some clean break. It was a single conversation with a senior operator who had nothing to prove and no appetite for theater. A woman who asked me a very dry question about revenue leakage in a product line and then sat through my answer without interrupting, and when I finished she said, in the same tone she might use to order coffee, that if I wanted a real seat I needed to stop doing my work in my brother's shadow because shadows bend numbers, and when you work in one long enough people start to think you and the shadow are the same thing, which made me angry in a way that was not loud but was steady. And from that day I began moving my references and my data and my track record into rooms that did not know my last name. You should know, because it matters, that I did not hide what he had done to me from the headhunter he used to brag about, and I did not turn it into a grievance either. I treated it like a case study, and I walked her through how I rebuilt a customer retention funnel that had been ignored because it did not make anyone look brilliant in a presentation, and I brought proof, which looked like quiet quarter-over-quarter improvement that you only notice if you care about the compounding effect of boring fixes, and she did not congratulate me or call me impressive. She simply asked me to take 2 calls with people who distrust buzzwords, which was exactly the room I wanted to be in, because people who distrust buzzwords also distrust gossip, which meant I could finally be evaluated on whether I could actually move a stubborn number. That was the slow work, the stacking of receipts that would eventually make it easy for someone with power to choose me without needing to defend the choice. But there was also the faster work, the strategic part that felt like revenge even though it looked like diligence. And it started with me mapping his department from the outside without ever touching a confidential file, which is more doable than people think when you listen to what vendors complain about and you read the footnotes in public reports. And what I saw was a pattern you would recognize even if you have never worked a day in corporate life, which is the pattern of a leader who got comfortable polishing slide decks instead of fixing the boring leaks he kept promising to get to next quarter. So when the company that would become my company started interviewing me, I did not pitch myself as a newer version of him or a more charming version of him. I positioned myself as the person who would take one ugly problem off their plate in a fixed timeline with transparent metrics, and I named the metrics and the timeline and the cost of doing nothing. And I said that if they wanted brilliant theater, they should keep looking, and I watched relief move across people's faces who are tired of being dazzled and let down. And while those conversations were happening, I did something that will sound small but was surgical, which was that I reached out to 3 of the strongest operators in his team, not to recruit them or to pit them against him, but to ask for 5 minutes of their brains on a very narrow question each, and I promised them I would not use their names in any materials, and I kept that promise, and what they gave me in those conversations was not gossip, it was the exact friction points they were tired of patching, and those points became the backbone of the plan the chief executive later called CRISP. By the time he realized I was in the running, the story he preferred to tell about me being too soft had nowhere to land, because the people holding the decision were not interested in personality labels. They were interested in whether their problem could be solved without a mutiny, and my plan did that by elevating 2 of his quieter managers and formalizing something they were already doing in the shadows, which sounds simple, but in a company that had been trained to wait for his approval. On every pivot it was almost radical, and that is where the word revenge starts to fit, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because there is a particular satisfaction in lifting the very people he overlooked and making them the center of the fix, which meant that even if he tried to claw back status later, the bright light would no longer be pointed at him by default. The access freeze he hit that morning was not personal. It was a routine control tied to a transition policy I had insisted on in writing as a condition of my acceptance, because I was not going to inherit a mess without clarity on who touched what and when. And while he was typing frustrated messages to operations, I was on a scheduled call with compliance where I asked, calmly and on record, for a standard vendor review on a side contract he had shepherded for years without ever documenting renewal criteria beyond friendship, and I was very careful in that call to state that I was not alleging wrongdoing and that I was requesting the review as part of onboarding, which is both true and strategic. Because what it actually did was place a neutral spotlight on a deal that had quietly bled money and buy me the air cover to sunset it without looking vindictive. If you want the flashier kind of revenge, you might be disappointed by how boring that sounds, but if you have ever watched what happens when a vendor who expects a rubber stamp gets a list of questions tied to performance triggers, you know that the temperature in a room can change without a single raised voice, and that is what I wanted. A change in temperature that signaled to everyone paying attention that the era of charming improvisation had ended and the era of scorekeeping had begun. And the person who understood that fastest was the chief financial officer, who sent me a 2-line note that said thank you for putting this in writing and looping me in early, which is the corporate equivalent of an endorsement swear words could never buy. By afternoon, I had confirmation that the board appointment for the new year would include a short, factual briefing on transition priorities, and that I would be introduced not with speeches, but with a list of deliverables. Which is exactly how I wanted it, because deliverables create protection, and protection creates room to make clean moves, and I had one more clean move planned before the year turned, a move that, on paper, looked like mentoring and, in reality, would remove the last safety net he believed he could fall into if things went wrong, which is a sentence I will explain in full when we get to the call I placed that evening to a person he took for granted, a person who answered on the first ring and changed the timeline for everyone involved. If you have ever worked anywhere long enough to see someone start believing their position is permanent, then you already understand the way Ryan had settled into his role, moving through the corridors of his company with the kind of ease that comes from assuming no one has the authority or the will to replace you, and that assumption, more than any lack of skill or bad decision, was the slow poison that made my work so much easier. Because a man who cannot imagine being replaced does not build the kind of defenses that matter when someone who understands the terrain quietly starts dismantling them from the edges inward. And that is exactly what I was doing in the months leading up to Christmas, without him even noticing. He had been moved into a position where every misstep would have an audience. I had already known from conversations with people inside his company that the new chief executive, a man who had inherited a culture thick with old loyalties and quiet backroom deals, was not interested in grand speeches or loyalty parades, but in clean numbers and visible results, and that kind of leadership shift is dangerous for someone like Ryan, because his entire way of operating depended on controlling the narrative rather than the metrics. So, while he was still thinking in terms of optics, I focused on substance, and it turned out that fixing a few stubborn problems he had ignored for months was not only easier than he made it sound, but also far more visible in the right rooms, because every improvement showed up directly on the dashboards the executive team reviewed weekly. To make it even harder for him to maintain his image, I fed the system a few small, undeniable truths through completely separate channels, nothing dramatic, just concise, verifiable points about his reliance on outdated strategies and his tendency to roll forward the same underperforming plans into each new quarter with only cosmetic changes. I never attached my name to any of it. Instead, I let it appear through the normal gossip filtering mechanisms of corporate life, where anonymous concerns in the right inbox can take on a life of their own, especially when they match what people have already been noticing but were reluctant to put into words themselves. By the time those comments reached him, he dismissed them as noise, and that dismissal, ironically, became part of the case against him, because nothing signals leadership fatigue more than the refusal to engage with valid criticism. The real turning point, though, came when I was brought into a meeting under the title of external consultant to discuss a failing rollout he had been responsible for. He had no idea I was listening in until my name was called to weigh in on a problem his own team had been unable to solve, and in that moment, I could see the exact calculation happening in his head. The one where he tried to decide whether to treat me as an ally or as an intruder, and he chose the middle ground, the polite, careful tone that masks irritation. I answered the question plainly, laying out the issue and the fix without taking credit for any of the ideas his team had offered, and I did it in a way that showed I had absorbed their frustrations and turned them into a workable plan. That single answer shifted the mood in the virtual room, because it was obvious to everyone that I could navigate the mess without the ego tics that had slowed him down. Outside of those visible moments, I was still making smaller moves that would seem insignificant on their own, but were collectively reshaping the decision-making landscape. For example, I arranged to share a case study from my last role with the executive team, a study that mirrored the exact challenges Ryan's department was facing, but in a different market, and I positioned it as a conversation starter, not a pitch. What made it effective was not just the solution it outlined, but the fact that the solution directly addressed pain points they had been tolerating under his leadership for far too long. It gave the decision-makers something tangible to compare against his work without me ever having to say his name. Meanwhile, I kept the personal interactions with him bland, almost neutral, because drawing attention to our history would have given him a reason to frame my presence as a personal vendetta, and I needed him to believe, at least for now, that I was operating in a different lane. He even called me one evening under the guise of just checking in and launched into a lecture about how the corporate world can chew up people who mistake early wins for long-term power. I listened, agreed with him where agreement cost me nothing, and even thanked him for the insight, knowing full well that the advice he thought was protecting me was actually revealing exactly how blind he had become to his own weaknesses. The irony in all of this is that the more he tried to appear unbothered, the more visible the cracks became to the people above him. He started missing small deadlines he would have once met without question, shrugging them off as low priority when in reality they were the small threads that held his credibility together. And every time he failed to follow through, I made sure that a cleaner, faster alternative was ready to present, not with a flourish, not with an announcement, but with the quiet efficiency that makes people stop asking why you're in the room and start asking why you're not in more of them. By the time the decision-makers were comparing candidates for his role, he had been framed, not by any single action of mine, but by a series of his own choices stacked against the contrast I had been deliberately offering. And the most important part was that none of it looked like a direct attack. It all looked like the natural conclusion of performance gaps meeting opportunity, which meant there would be no last-minute defense he could mount without sounding paranoid or bitter. I could have stopped there, content to let the process play out, but I wanted one more layer of insurance, and that meant setting up a conversation with someone who had once been one of his strongest supporters, someone who was still on the inside, but had grown disillusioned with his leadership. I knew that if I could redirect their loyalty without asking them to betray him outright, they would become the quiet validator of every strength I had been positioning in the background. That conversation was already on the calendar, and I planned to make it the cleanest move yet, the kind of shift that doesn't just remove a piece from the board, but changes the way the whole game is played from that point forward. By the time the offer was actually in my hands, phrased in that deliberately cautious corporate language that makes it sound as if you are being invited to consider a slightly elevated responsibility rather than being handed the keys to someone else's office, I had already decided that the transition would be as clean as it was ruthless, and that meant agreeing to the confidentiality clause without hesitation, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because secrecy was its own kind of weapon. The company wanted the change to remain quiet until after the new year to avoid the usual gossip chain and potential disruption, but for me, the silence was even more valuable because it gave me the chance to step into rooms as a so-called consultant and watch Ryan operate without him realizing that every misstep was being cataloged not for my amusement, but as supporting evidence for why the board's decision had been inevitable. The first meeting I shadowed was one of those mid-level strategy reviews that senior managers sometimes treat as an opportunity to showcase how busy they are rather than to actually solve problems, and Ryan came in late, sliding into the conversation with a half-joking apology about back-to-back calls, which might have been charming to people who did not know how often he used that line to avoid having to prepare real answers. I stayed off camera, muted, introduced only by my first name, and I listened as he delivered a series of generic updates that sounded polished, but revealed nothing about actual progress. Then came a moment when a department head hesitantly raised an issue about a contract delay, and instead of drilling into the problem, Ryan pivoted to a long-winded story about how the client had been difficult from day one, as if that somehow justified the lack of movement. That was the moment I spoke for the first time, addressing the department head directly, asking a Single, very specific question about the current stage of the approval process, a question that cut through the narrative and made it clear that the real delay was internal, not external. There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when everyone in a meeting suddenly realizes they have been talking around the problem rather than into it, and while no one said anything overt, I could feel the air shift. It was not dramatic, it was subtle. The kind of shift that leaves an impression hours later when people replay the conversation in their heads and realize that the outsider's question exposed the exact place where the system was failing. Ryan tried to regain control with a quick reassurance that it was already being handled, but the credibility had already slipped, and I did not have to do anything else in that meeting except remain silent and let the contrast speak for itself. Over the next 2 weeks, I repeated that same pattern in 3 more meetings, never dominating the discussion, never contradicting him outright, but asking questions so precise that they made the gaps impossible to ignore. Each time, I positioned my comments as helpful, as a way of supporting the team, and each time, the people listening became a little less convinced that Ryan was the person who should be steering those decisions. I never once referenced my future role, but by the end of that period, I knew that more than a few people had guessed it because the tone in follow-up emails shifted from polite distance to guarded curiosity, as if they were trying to decide whether they should start aligning themselves with me now or wait for the official announcement. What Ryan didn't know, and what I had made sure to engineer, was that I had also been quietly sitting down with 2 people he had long considered part of his inner circle, both of whom had grown tired of carrying the weight of projects he had been too distracted or disinterested to manage properly. I never asked them to betray him or speak against him. Instead, I asked them what resources they would need if they were given more autonomy, and I listened carefully to every frustration they voiced. By the time we finished those conversations, I had a clear picture of how to restructure their roles in a way that would make them more effective while also ensuring their loyalty to me once the transition became public. It wasn't about turning them against him, it was about making it clear that under my leadership, their work would be seen and credited rather than absorbed into his portfolio and forgotten. The most satisfying part of this phase was that I didn't have to force his downfall. All I had to do was stop protecting him from the natural consequences of his habits. When you remove the safety nets, the quiet fixes, the behind-the-scenes cleanups, the extra reminders before deadlines, a person who has been leaning on them for years starts to trip over their own assumptions, and Ryan was no different. One missed follow-up became 2, a postponed decision turned into a stalled project, and by the time the end-of-year review cycle began, his file looked like a list of delayed initiatives and unresolved issues. I knew because I was now sitting in on the review discussions, watching as the people who had once defended him in these sessions hesitated before speaking, and in corporate life, hesitation is often the first step toward replacement. Christmas was only days away when I had my final conversation with the chief executive before the public announcement. He told me the decision was locked, that the paperwork was ready, and that all that remained was for the board to sign off on the formal transition plan in January. Then he asked me, almost casually, if I intended to tell Ryan before the holiday or let him find out with everyone else. I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to be sure I was making it for the right reasons. In the end, I decided I wouldn't say a word. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about discipline. Letting my father deliver the news at Christmas dinner meant I could keep my hands clean, and it would strip away any chance for Ryan to spin a preemptive story to save face. I left that conversation knowing that in less than a week, the balance of our family dynamic and his professional identity would tilt permanently, and the best part was that nothing about it would look like an ambush. From the outside, it would seem as though the company had simply decided to make a change, as companies do, and the fact that the replacement happened to be his sister would be chalked up to coincidence by anyone who wasn't paying attention. But the people who were paying attention would know better, and Ryan, most of all, would understand that this was not a coincidence, not a lucky break, and certainly not an accident. It was the final play in a game he didn't even realize we were both playing until the board was already set in my favor. I woke up the morning after Christmas with that dull mix of adrenaline and calm that only shows up when the worst part is over yet the most important part is still ahead, because as satisfying as it had been to let my father drop the line that froze the table, I knew the real satisfaction would come from the part no one sees, the quiet paperwork and the simple emails, and the one call that would lock the door behind me in a way he could not pry open with charm or force, and I did exactly what I had promised myself I would do, which was open my laptop and send a single clean note to the chief executive and the chief financial officer confirming that, per our agreement, I would assume oversight of the contracted side venture Ryan had been nurturing like a personal playground, a venture the company still paid for but never properly audited, and that I would exercise the clause we had negotiated that made me the ultimate approver of renewals, budget, and deliverables, which is a fancy way of saying I would be the client he now had to answer to whether he liked it or not. People imagine revenge as a speech or a dramatic confrontation, but in corporate life the most devastating blow is often a sentence that looks boring on the page and unremarkable in conversation, and this sentence, that I would be the approver, was the sentence that changed his weather, because it meant that even if he tried to paint the transition as a temporary hiccup or a misunderstanding, the work he leaned on for status and side favors now lived under my key, and the vendors who once treated him like a king would read my name and adjust their tone without a word being spoken, which is exactly what happened when I made the call I had lined up the night before to the person he most took for granted. The operations lead at that vendor who had been renewing on autopilot for years, a woman who answered on the first ring because she knew my number from quiet pre-work and because she, like me, was tired of the dance. I told her, in a level voice that did not invite negotiation, that the next renewal would be tied to measurable outcomes rather than the usual glossy slide deck and warm relationships. And I asked for a straightforward delivery calendar with penalties for missed checkpoints, not as a trap, but as a detox for a relationship that had been running on vibes. And when she tried to float the familiar language about long-standing partnerships and flexibility, I said I respect history, but I answer to performance, and I followed it with the line that stripped the varnish clean, which was that all communication on the contract would now route through my office, and that any exceptions would be treated as a red flag, and I could feel the shift on her end of the call. Not panic, but recalibration, the way people sound when they realize the room has a new temperature, and they either dress for it or they leave. The first text from Ryan hit my phone before noon, something polite on the surface with that old syrup underneath, asking whether there had been some confusion with access and whether I could nudge operations to restore a few folders because he needed to wrap things before the new year, and I read it twice and put the phone face down, because I had promised myself that I would not give him the drama he could turn into sympathy, and instead I sent a short written response through the official channel stating that the freeze was standard during leadership transition and that all materials needed for his exit package would be provided by compliance on a defined timeline. And I copied the chief executive and legal because I wanted the thread clean and permanent. And I cannot describe the peace that comes from removing yourself as the last line of emotional labor for a man who has always expected you to rescue him when his confidence finally writes a check his delivery cannot cash. The second move that afternoon was the one I had hinted at to you earlier, the one that looks like mentoring on the calendar, but is actually the removal of a safety net, because I called a senior client sponsor who had, for years, spoken highly of Ryan in public while privately nursing disappointment, and I told him I was stepping in, and that, out of respect for his patience, I would personally own the first 2 quarters of stabilization, and I asked him to do one thing for me, which was to forward any direct outreach from Ryan to my office without responding, not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because I needed the noise to stop so the work could start. And the sponsor agreed with a kind of relieved laugh that told me more than any complaint ever could, which is that people will tolerate a great deal when they feel trapped, but they never forget what freedom feels like once somebody hands it to them. The real twist, and you will appreciate this if you have ever wanted a win that could not be undone by a meeting full of spin, came in the form of a small internal memo I drafted that afternoon and walked through with finance. A memo that restructured the reporting lines in a way that elevated the 2 managers Ryan had kept safely in his shadow, and I made the changes look procedural rather than punitive, tying them to deliverables and audit controls so neat that anyone who tried to reverse them later would look like they were choosing personality over performance, and when those 2 managers saw their names next to real authority, I watched their posture change even over video. The way people do when they realize they are no longer required to ask for permission to do the job they've been doing unofficially for years. If you are waiting for the part where I caved and called him to offer a soft landing, I need you to understand that there is a difference between cruelty and clarity, and what I gave him was clarity, not vengeance. Because the truth is that I did not want to see him humiliated. I wanted to see him contained, and those are not the same thing, and the way you contain someone like him is not by arguing with him or mocking him. It is by closing doors gently and locking them without noise so that when he turns the handle there is no audience, only the simple fact that the door does not open for him anymore. The announcement went out in the first week of January with the kind of concise language that sends a signal without theatrics, and I spent that day not basking in anything but holding a dozen short calls where I asked useful questions and gave clear deadlines. Because I wanted the team to feel, immediately, that what had changed was not only the name on the door but the pace and the permission to do the work without fear of being undercut for the sake of somebody else's narrative, and that night, when my father called with a careful, searching tone and asked me if I was happy, I told him I was not chasing happy, I was chasing clean, and clean is what we finally had. Ryan sent one more message that evening, a last attempt to pull me into a debate about what family owes family and how I could have given him a heads up and spared him the shock. And I stared at the screen and thought about every time I had given him a heads up and all it had done was buy him another month of grace. He used to build a case against my competence, and I closed the thread without replying because the win was not in the last word. The win was in the calendar invites already sent, and the contracts already rewritten and the reporting lines already moved. The kind of win that cannot be undone by a story at a bar or a complaint whispered into a friendly ear. You can call it ruthless if you want, and maybe you will be right, but when I turned off the light that night, I felt something I had not felt since the first time he made me doubt myself, which was the understanding that I had finally stopped asking permission to be the adult in my own life, and the woman who did that did not need applause or forgiveness or a neat moral to make it palatable. She needed results and protection and a plan that closed with a final move no one could wiggle out of. And that is what this was, not a spectacle. Not a public beating, but a checkmate written in plain words and signed by people who do not care about family drama, which is why, even with the loose ends that will always exist in families like mine, I can say without hesitation that I won, not because he lost a chair, but because I took the whole board and made it operate on rules that finally made sense.